Welcome to another e-update and learning, and in today's session we're going to take a quick look at making BAS payments. Now BAS has many components on it, and today we're going to take a look at GST paid and collected, as well as PAYG, withholding, and how to process the BAS payment. Let's take a first look at GST. You should notice in your system there are at least 2 accounts set up for handling GST. Now let's have a look in this Autosoft system here, and what we'll find is there's an account set up to handle GST paid, such as this one here, account 1200, and there should also be an account set up to handle GST collected. Now there may be some other accounts in your system, such as GST floor plan pending, GST notional, and even things such as luxury car tax collected. Now these all relate to GST and other taxation issues, but we're not going to focus on those because those things should take care of themselves in your system. Now what we want to do is come back to account 1200. What you'll notice in here is if I look at the transactions that are sitting in account 1200, they all relate to transactions which have been made in the system. If I have a look at this one here, this $1,000 for Pickles Auctions, I can see it relates to the acquisition of a vehicle. Now this vehicle cost us $11,000, but only $10,000 went to the actual inventory. The other $1,000 went to the GST paid account for us, and that's because this supplier was GST registered. Likewise, if I have a look at account 2050, the GST collected, we can see that there is many transactions all on the credit side in this case for things that we've sold. If we have a look at this here, we can see this transaction had GST of $53.90 in the transaction, which totaled $592.90. So 1/11 of that total has gone into the GST collected account here, account 2050. And that's what you should see in your system, is you should be able to see these kind of transactions in these 2 accounts, one for GST paid, one for GST collected. Now it's really quite simple. The net of these 2 amounts determines how much GST is either payable or refundable on your BAS statement. Now let's take a look at an example in our system. In our system here, I'm going to run the GST BAS totals, and I want you to take note of the numbers and totals in here. So in your system, if you're using Autosoft, you'll find it under the general ledger section there, GST BAS amounts. But if you're using another system, you should find similar things in the report section of that program, perhaps under a slightly different name, but probably in the general ledger section there as well. And what you can do is run the report for the period that you're going to have a look at. Now you notice this isn't a standard GST period I've got here, but for this system I'm using here, this example system, it's the first BAS that's been made, so it's going to be over this time frame. Now I'm going to just make that for the one branch in this Autosoft system. I'm going to bring it up onto the screen. Now we can see here we've got 2 columns. The first one is all about the GST that we've collected on the things we've sold, which was what we saw in account 2050, which was the GST collected general ledger account. And on the other side here, it's all about GST that we've paid when we've been buying things, which we'll remember was our 1200 account for GST paid. Now you can see the 2 totals there. We've got 10, 530 and 63, and 8465 and 24 cents. Now those totals should correspond back to what's in the balance sheet. So if we run a balance sheet as of the same date, what we'll see on the balance sheet is those 2 accounts that we're looking at. Now the first one was account 1200. So we can see here that account 1200 has the 8465 and 24 cents, and over the page there we can see the GST that we've collected, 10,530 and 63 cents. So the BAS totals and the BAS totals report are the same as what's in the general ledger accounts. So in this case here, if we were looking at these two things, we would actually have a BAS amount payable of about $2,000 odd. Now the next thing we want to consider is also PAYG withholding. You'll see here that on this system here there's an account 2120 accrued PAYG tax. Now that's $14,000. Now you should find that if your system's being run properly, in the payroll system you should be able to run something like a payroll transactions history report that shows you the total of all the transactions for the period you've selected. And you can see there in this system it tells me that the total of PAYG was $14,000. Now that's running for the same time period that I was running the BAS totals and ends at the same date that I ran the balance sheet. So the $14,000 was the total PAYG. And if I flick back to the accounting system there, I can see it corresponds to the total which is accrued in the balance sheet, $14,000. Now that's a payable as well. So I've got to pay the $2,000 odd for the GST as well as this $14,000 for PAYG. So in this case, I need to write a check and pay the tax office an amount of $16,000 odd. That's all good and well, but how do we do that in the system? Well, let's take a look. The best way to do this is by way of a journal. Now, using the journal voucher, we need to give the transaction a meaningful name. I'm going to say March 31 BAS payment. I'm going to post it on the 31st of March too. I'm going to show you why I'm going to do that in just a second. You can post it on the date that you draw the check, but I'm going to post it on the date that ended the period, just to show you how things reconcile up. Now, it's a good idea to start with the amount which we're paying. So we're going to pay amount out of the bank. So to reduce the bank, we're going to credit it. And I'm going to credit the bank by $16,072.39. Now it's important these are non-GST, so if you're using a system like the Autosoft one, it'll allow you to pick a GST type. So important to leave that as non-GST. Then on the PAYG payable account, which was 2120 if I recall correctly, I want to reduce that. So that's a credit balance at the moment. It's a payable in the system. So I'm going to debit that for the $14,007, leaving those non-GST as well. And then I want to go in and I want to post the amount of GST back against those GST control accounts. So the GST paid account, which was account 1200, what I want to do is I want to post a credit entry to that for $84.65.24. And for the GST collected account, that's a payable in the system, a credit balance. I'm going to post that as a debit in the journal. So $10,530.63. And what you'll see happens there is the journal balances. So I've got the amount we're paying the tax office, which is the net of the accrued PAYG tax, GST paid and GST collected. And those three balances should correspond to the balance sheet, accrued PAYG, GST collected, and over the page there down the bottom, the GST paid, $84.65.24, and they should also correspond to the BAS totals report.